Yeah. Let's start with the current situation of the Ukrainian army. And how do you find the current situation? They're trying to mobilize more people to be part of the, just let me check it out here. Yeah. They're trying to send more people to the battlefield. And Joseph Borrell reported that more than 70% of Ukrainian energy capacity have been destroyed. They have lost more than 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers in June. When would be that moment that NATO says, let's go after some sort of political settlement?
First of all, just to be specific on your question, it's not NATO. I would say it's even more EU than NATO, in fact, because NATO as an alliance is not directly involved, if you want. You have NATO countries, definitely, and you have involvement of certain agencies of NATO. For instance, the use of the E3 AWACS that belong to NATO at the Bulgarian, Romanian, and Polish border. So they monitor the air situation, not permanently, but in quite extensively. So, but NATO as an organization is probably less involved than the EU. And when you mentioned Joseph Borrell, he is the representative for foreign affairs of the EU. So I think it's important to remind people of that, because that's the reason why you have those bilateral treaties between Ukraine and individual countries, and even a bilateral treaty between Ukraine and EU, by the way. So that's the first thing. And to the essence of your question, well, we know, and the Russians have acknowledged that they are fighting an attrition war. And they are, in fact, engaging into, not engaging, they are engaged into aggressive attrition war. That means that the aim is not to take territory, but to destroy a potential. And in the first part of the war, I mean, the first step of the war, I would say, until summer 2022, they focused at destroying the military potential, I mean, the material potential of Ukrainian army. And they achieved that because from June 2022, Zelensky said, from now on, we are depending on the West for sustaining this war. And that's what we have seen in the last 2 years. We have this constant support from NATO countries by providing equipment, especially equipment, advice and training, and also to some extent some units, special forces and things like this, like the British and the French have provided these kind of help. Probably for training purposes, but also probably for some operational commitments in certain areas for commando activities and things like this. In any case, the purpose from the Russian view, the Russian perspective, this war is an attrition war that primarily focuses at military potential, but, and since the West is actively supporting Ukraine, not just in terms of military supply, but also in providing industrial support. And remember that Rheinmetall, one of the biggest company for armament in Germany, is also building some factories in Ukraine, and the West is also assisting in designing and producing drones, in particularly sea-borne drones in the area of Odessa. So you have a deeper commitment of the West. in order to support the war economy, if you want, and definitely as Ukraine has clearly entered a phase of war economy, that means that the whole territory becomes a subject to attrition, not just the military. And that's by the way, remember that when Ukraine tried to attack some refineries in Russia, the West justified this by saying that Russia was in war economy, therefore the economy can also be a target. Well, the fact of the matter is that the Russian system, if you want, or Russia, is not in a war economy. And that's the reason why the Russians are very keen in separating geographically the zone of operation. They have Russia, I mean, the Russia within the borders of 1991, if you want, and the territory of Ukraine, I mean, the Teatr Военных Действий, this is the theater of military operation, which is the whole of Ukraine. And by separating the two, they clearly say that they have a normal life, if you want, in Russia, no war economy per se, even if the military industrial complex has been boosted by the conflict. And you have the zone of operation. Now, for Ukraine, the situation is a little bit different because since the West is trying to involve itself into the Ukrainian economy, that means that the whole of Ukraine is in war economy, and therefore the attempt of the Russians to destroy the power station and the power grid and all that, this is primarily designed at the war economy. Now, we have also to be careful because you may remember that in October 2022, the Russians started to attack some component of the power grid. And I can recommend here an article of John Helmer on his blog, Dancing with Bears, where he explains exactly that at this stage, I mean, end of 2022, the issue was not so much the war economy, the Ukrainian war economy, but it was about exhausting and depleting the anti-aircraft and anti-missile capabilities of Ukraine. And therefore, they attacked items that had to be protected by anti-missile systems, but trying to avoid I mean, to affect the civilian infrastructure. This has changed since the end of last year because of the extended support provided by the West to Ukraine, and also because the West has also provided Ukraine with some kind of authorization of using their missiles on the Russian territory. Therefore, then Russia has also stepped up its attrition war, if you want, and started to attack items related to the war economy. And when you may remember that we had a couple of weeks ago this incident involving a missile on an annex of the children's hospital in Kiev. And I don't want here to discuss the specific of this incident, but the interesting thing is that the context of when this incident happened was the attack of the Artyom production complex, which is just 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers next to this hospital, and which is devoted to the production of missiles and rockets and things like this. So we see that Russia has try to destroy the war economy. They destroyed no longer the small pieces of the power grid, but attack directly the production, the power production plants. So here there's also a difference between what we see today and what we saw in end of 2022. In 2022, it was just the distribution network, if you want. Today, it's the production, power production network. So it's a little bit deeper. But the bottom line is that if you combine both the destruction of the economic potential of Ukraine, and you have all these attack, I mean the result or the casualties on the battlefield, we see that Ukraine is more and more weakened. And we have currently, right now, we have discussions between the financial institutions, Western financial institutions, and the government of Ukraine to see how we can solve, or how the West can solve the financial situation of Ukraine, because it might be that within the coming weeks, Ukraine may be declared in default. That means that Ukraine may not be able to fund its own the debt, its own debt, and this must be also considered in the context of a changing of leadership in the U.S. Because with the, let's say, the increasing probability to have Donald Trump elected in November, that means that there is an increased probability that the US might be increasingly reluctant to fund Ukraine and to fund the war in Ukraine, meaning that the financial support and the economic support of Ukraine would fall completely under the responsibility of the EU. And that's where we start to see problems, because the EU itself has domestic issues of economic nature, and in particular big countries such as Germany and France, which are the two engines of the European economy. Those two engines are in poor condition at this stage. And that means that the war effort that was provided to Ukraine might not be available at the end of this year, meaning that Ukraine might face the whole consequences of this war. I mean, financial consequences of the war in the late fall this year. As a result, there are serious concerns about the ability of Ukraine to continue waging a war. And we see that Europe, despite the narrative that they have said that they would continue unlimited support to Ukraine, they may have physical and financial limits to this support. And that's exactly the problem today. And beyond the situation on the ground, on the battlefield, which is even more unfavorable for Ukraine, you have a general economic situation which is disastrous for Ukraine. And that's the reason why we have, with the time, we have more, let's say, pressure on Ukraine to have a negotiation, or Ukraine would enter kind of a process of having talks, at least, with Russia. And that explains most probably the attitude of Zelensky that has radically changed after the summit of Birkenstock in Switzerland. And now Zelensky acknowledged that if you want to have any success in any kind of peace process, they need to involve Russia. The problem is probably that they haven't acknowledged that if Russia will take part of, or if Russia would take part to negotiations, then that means that Russia would also have its words to say. And it's not just a situation as the previous conferences were aiming at. That means that was because all the conferences we had based on the 10 points formula plan of Zelensky, these conferences were based on agreeing on a capitulation declaration, and this capitulation declaration being presented to Russia so that Russia would accept to capitulate, in fact. And that was said, by the way, by the Swiss government to Russia before the summit in Birkenstock, when there were some contacts, but the Swiss said to Russia, you might be able to attend the conference, but you will not have the right to say anything. So, meaning that it was not designed to be a negotiation, but just Russia to be presented a text declaring that Russia would capitulate. So if there is another conference, certainly the Russians will not accept such a situation. They didn't accept in the past, and there is no reason for them to accept that in the future. So, but I'm not sure that the West has really understood that. And Zelensky, he may agree to have the Russians, but I'm not sure that he would agree to discuss all the matters that need to be discussed in order to have a comprehensive solution of the situation. I remind you that out of the 10 points of the Zelensky's formula, only 3 was eventually selected to be discussed at the Bergenstock summit. This is the freedom of movement on the Black Sea. This is the nuclear security, especially of the nuclear power plant of Zaporozhye. And there is the exchange of prisoner of war. Now, those 3 points, which are based, by the way, on UN resolutions, are issues that are probably they might not be so contentious, and probably we could have a positive dialogue with Russia on that. More contentious are definitely the territorial issues, the question of the status of the 4 regions that are currently partially occupied by Russia, and that Putin wants to be evacuated by the Ukrainians in order to integrate those region into Russia. And then the status of Crimea and the 2 popular republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. So all these aspects, I'm not sure Zelensky has realized that he might eventually be forced to discuss that, because this is one of the conditions posed by Vladimir Putin to enter a negotiation process. I remind you that on the 14th of June, Vladimir Putin expressed or defined 2 conditions to enter talks with Ukraine, and namely the territorial question that I just mentioned, plus the commitment of Ukraine not wanting and not entering NATO. So these are the 2 major points, and I'm not sure that Zelensky has already internalized these 2 questions into his equation. So my view, again, I'm not in the head of Volodymyr Zelensky, but what I've seen in the press recently is that Volodymyr Zelensky wants to discuss the 3 points that were discussed in Bergenstock, but that's not the major issue. So we are I'm not sure people are understanding what each other party wants. I mean, I'm confident that the Russians understand perfectly the Ukrainians. I'm not sure that the Ukrainians want to understand what Russia means. And I say they don't want to understand because the Europeans behind the scene try to force Zelensky not to engage into the conditions and preconditions defined by Vladimir Putin. So we are in a strange, it's a strange kind of dialogue where nobody is communicating somehow. We are, you have people communicating, they're passing each other. And what Zelensky intends is probably not exactly what he might need to do if he wants to solve the problem. So that's a little bit the situation. But definitely, as time goes, we see that the situation of Ukraine is degrading rapidly, and we may have the point where the a part of the population ask and press the government to have negotiation. As of today, a recent poll um, provided or published by zend.ua, which is a Ukrainian website, by the way, and they ordered a poll regarding peace negotiations. 44% of the Ukrainians are favorable of negotiations, while 35% don't want any negotiations. And if we look at these percentages, we can see it's consistent with 35% representing the western part of Ukraine, and the rest being this part of Ukraine, which is still quite extensively Russian-speaking or other minorities. So we can say that those, let me call them Ukrainians, are definitely refusing any opportunity to negotiate, while the rest of Ukraine, that includes Russian speaking, but also Hungarian speaking, Romanian speaking minorities, may want to have negotiations. And this is also what I'm saying is reinforced by the fact that more and more you have a recruitment and forceful recruitment performed within these areas that are minorities. And by the way, this is something that Viktor Orban discussed with Volodymyr Zelensky as he visited him a couple of weeks ago. And because we know that the Hungarian minority has been subject to many exactions performed by the Ukrainians. But recently they have been more involved into forceful recruitment, and that's something that Hungary is vigorously opposed, because they consider that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not a conflict that should involve the Hungarian minority. The Hungarian minority has absolutely nothing against Russia. In fact, remember that after the laws that were passed both in 2014 and in 2021, I would say this kind of, some say racist laws. The word racist is probably a little bit too strong, but let's call them like this. In any case, those laws concerned both the Russian-speaking minority as the other minorities. Problem is that the Russian-speaking minority is the largest one, and that's the reason why you have all these issues with the Donbass and all that evolved into the conflict that we have now. But all these measures taken by the non-elected government in 2014 against minorities concerned also the minorities in the West, and namely in Transcarpathia, which is ethnic Hungarian area. And that's the reason why Hungary has been adamant to let's say, not to support the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. It's not because Viktor Orban is pro-Russian, but it's because Viktor Orban supports the Hungarian minority, which is just next door on the Ukrainian side of the border. And that's the issue. The problem is that the Western media never mentioned that, because that would underline the fact that the authorities that came out of the Euromaidan in 2014 were racist or supremacist, better said, supremacist authorities, that they wanted a supremacy of the ethnic Hungarians, if you want, rather at the expense of the other minorities. And that's the whole question. And that's the reason why you have this posture of Viktor Orban regarding the conflict. So in a nutshell, this is the situation.
When you look at the way that the European Union is trying to convince Zelensky not to talk with Russians, and do you think how much of this behavior is related to the presidential election in the United States, that they're trying to do their best in order to help the Democratic Party?
It's complicated because, first of all, we have in Europe, regardless of how you feel about Western Europe, Russia, and all that, there has been a fear of Russia since the late 19th century. And this fear became very concrete, if you want, as communism developed from 1917 in Russia. And then you had, in fact, two different threats superposed. You have the Russian threat superposed to the communist threat. And after the Second World War, what became predominant is the fear of communism. And in fact, the Cold War is about this conflict between two systems, not between countries or societies or individuals, but between two political systems. The Western, let's say, free market economy system on the Western side, and the communist, socialist, Marxist, you can call them as you want. All the experts may find differences in all that, but in essence, that was the Marxist world, and nobody wanted to have that in Western Europe. And that's basically the essence of the Cold War. As the Cold War stopped, for a couple of years, the West accepted the existence of Russia, as Russia was weakened and didn't look very threatening. The things changed in the early 2000s as Vladimir Putin started to reconstruct, to rebuild Russia that had been totally destroyed by domestic problems, including organized criminality, corruption, and these were all the results of the communist era. And under the Boris Yeltsin, Russia didn't really recover, and Western countries took advantage of that and destroyed even more Russia. So the effort of Vladimir Putin, as he came into power in the year 2000, end of 2000, was to rebuild Russia and to rebuild a country, basically. And that was that was, if you want, exacerbated by the fact that from 2002 onwards, USA started to withdraw from the arms control agreement that you had, and therefore um, Russia had to show a more, let's say, affirmative stance. And that's what Vladimir Putin expressed in the Security Conference in Munich in 2007. And from that point, you have definitely this kind of break between Russia and the West. And we are still in this dynamic. And in Europe, you have this fear, which is strongly supported and, let's say, supported, and I would say even driven by the mood of the ex Eastern European countries, such as the Baltic states, Poland, Romania to some extent, and Bulgaria, who definitely, in order to have the support of the United States, decided to have a more, let's say, aggressive stance towards Russia. And in that respect, they receive unlimited support, both military and economic, from the United States. And they're bound to United States has just increased since then. And I have already said on your channel, when I spent 5 years in NATO, I was surprised to see the influence that the Baltic states and Poland have in NATO, although they are not the most, let's say, the strongest countries in the military setting of NATO, but politically they are strong supporter of US, and they are strongly supported by the US. And you find exactly the same thing in the EU. Just notice that the replacement you mentioned, Joseph Borrell, he will change, he will leave, and his replacement will be Kaja Kallas, who used to be the Prime Minister of Estonia, which is a very tiny country of not even 1.5 million inhabitants. So meaning that the proportional importance of the Baltic states is enormous. And that feeds this anti-Russian rhetoric. And that's a little bit what we are witnessing in Europe. So that's a very important point to keep in mind. This is this very strong anti-Russian narrative and posture that you have increasingly in Europe. This was amplified by the demonization of Vladimir Putin as a new Hitler, and so on and so forth. Now, the situation in the United States has become even more a problem for Europe because, as I said before, most of the support that was provided to Ukraine came from the United States, both in terms of military supply or equipment and financial support. Now, the EU knows that it will not be able to, let's say, replace this the support of the United States, and that's the reason why you have in Europe, you have the rhetoric against Russia that is increasing, because now we have to create even a more dangerous enemy of Russia in order to have this, let's say, solidarity for Ukraine. Because at the end of the day, as the European countries will not afford to support Ukraine with as a courant normal, that means the normal flow of affairs, that will require more effort from the European government including financial efforts. And that means that this effort will be paid by the taxpayers in Europe. And that's why you have this rhetoric that is starting to develop, that Russia is almost defeated, and we have more and more articles underlining the lack of tanks, the lack of artillery, the lack of everything in Russia. This is exactly the same narrative that we had in 2022, which proved false, and we are repeating exactly the same thing. But the purpose today is just to help the European countries to mobilize in order to support Ukraine by suggesting that the defeat of Russia is close, is very close. So this is a kind of manipulation of the European public opinion, if you want, because nothing on the battlefield indicates that Russia is in a situation of weakness. On the contrary, and that was acknowledged by several technical publications in the West, by the way, in the United States and in the UK, that underlines the industrial capabilities of Russia that has been significantly improved and increased in the last couple of years, and that on the other side, on the Western side, if you want, the military industrial complex is not in a position to compete. And that's certainly true for the whole West, but that's even more true for European military industrial complex, because this military industrial complex was largely disbanded after the end of the Cold War. The US managed to keep a very strong military industrial complex, and that was probably one of the reasons for maintaining to those wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and so on and so forth, in order to keep this military industrial complex. And that's probably for the US the reason for having this kind of endless wars, just to maintain an apparatus. And the reason for that for the US is probably because they have observed that in Europe the opposite have appeared, so that after the Cold War. That means that after the Cold War, every country started to disband its military industrial complex. That is very much the case in Switzerland. That was the case in Germany, in France, in the UK as well, because after the Cold War, the prospect for war in Europe faded away, and therefore the idea if you have a military industrial complex which is market based, of course these companies are not stupid, and if they see that there's no prospect for war and no prospect for use of military equipment, then better changing your activities and embracing more civilian activities, and that's what they did. So we have this situation in Europe, and today Europe is facing a challenge, because if the US withdraws from this Ukrainian issue, that means that everything of the whole conflict and the support of Ukraine will rest on the arms of the Europe. But Europe has not the capacities to create that. That means that they have to recreate their own military industrial complex. But the problem is, because we are talking about private companies that are looking for profit. So private companies say, well, okay, we're ready to increase our production and all that, but for how long? And for what prospect? And for what kind of war? So that means that there is a very clear challenge for Europe right now, and that will not be solved within weeks, especially now in the summertime. So we are in a situation where this situation will continue to degrade for Ukraine, and the problem is the Europeans will try to convince US to continue their support to Ukraine, but I'm not sure that the US, especially Donald Trump and JD Vance, by the way, he is selected vice president, they're obviously not willing to invest in money that will provide no return on investment, because everybody understands. I mean, if you look at the problem rationally, you understand that regardless of how many resources you put in Ukraine, Russia will win. And as long as you haven't defined exactly what you expect from your investment in Ukraine, I mean, in supporting Ukraine, what you expect in terms of objectives, or if you say differently, how you define victory against Russia, or on the other side, how you define a defeat of Russia, then there is absolutely no chance that the U.S. will participate in funding a war that has no objective and is in essence pointless, because at this stage we are not improving the situation in Ukraine, and that's, I think, the U.S. intelligence organization have identified this. And that's the reason why the Pentagon, since last year, by the way, he is very, let's say, he's not very enthusiastic, let's put it that way. He's not very enthusiastic in supporting the war in Ukraine. The support to Ukraine comes more from the politicians, the same as you have in Europe, by the way. So they are fanatical politicians. The word fanatical is, I think there is no other words to say that, because it's beyond rationale, it's beyond facts, it's beyond everything you may define as rational for a war. If a war is rational, that's another discussion. But in any case, we have the politicians, and Joe Biden is one of them. Anthony Blinken is another one, who definitely tried to continue this war. But now I mentioned this fear of Russia. It's interesting to see that Anthony Blinken has his origins in Ukraine. I mean, his family originates in Ukraine. The same with Victoria Nuland. And if you look at Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, his grandfather was the economic administrator. I mean, he belonged to the administration of Ukraine during World War II for the Nazis. So, and if you go beyond that, if you look in Canada, Chrystia Freeland is the granddaughter of a guy who collaborated with the Nazi in Ukraine. So you have a very strange constellation of individuals that I cannot say that is something that drives the conflict in Ukraine. But I cannot avoid to think that this is part of this fanatical stance that you have in Western politicians about the situation in Ukraine. And this is certainly something that affects the Western politicians. The military traditionally is probably more fact-based in assessing situations, is probably more sensitive or sensible to the actual situation on the ground and the impact that weapons have on the ground. And they monitor the situation. They know that everything we provided to Ukraine has basically failed, both because this was obsolete equipment that was not in a position to match the technology deployed by the Russians, or this was modern technology, But this technology could be, let's say, addressed very quickly by the Russians when they modified their software, if you want, or their methods, and especially electronic warfare, to counter this equipment. I'm talking about the HIMARS missiles, those small diameters bomb, guided bombs, and so on and so forth. So we have here, and the military is aware of that, so that the more we provided equipment to Ukrainians, the more we created an incentive for Russia to use even more technology, even more powerful weapons. And the whole thing is, in fact, driving Ukraine towards defeat. And when I say defeat, it might not even be political defeat, but decisive military defeat on the ground. So the military has understood that, not the politicians. And I don't know as of today how the situation will evolve in the US, given the fact that Joe Biden left the presidential race, and therefore you might have a change in. I mean, obviously you will have a replacement for the Democrats for the presidential race against Donald Trump, but that may also affect the way the Europeans will consider the conflict in Ukraine. And probably, I mean, not probably, but possibly, this may lead the Europeans to have a more, let's say, a realistic approach to the conflict and follow what Zelensky said. I mean, Zelensky, as I said before, he was keen to develop some contacts with Russia. I'm not sure, as I said before, that Zelensky has a clear understanding of what he expects from these talks, but in any case, he wants that. The interesting thing is that the Viktor Orban seems to have, by trying to, let's say, have the agreement of Russia, China to engage into talks, because he didn't engage into a mediation in a negotiation, but he wanted to explore the let's say the preparedness of Russia and China to engage in negotiations if the case comes up. But the interesting fact here is that the European Union was absolutely not supportive to this initiative. And that's where we might see a change in in the next months, because the conjunction of the readiness of Zelensky to slightly open a door towards Russia, the preparedness of countries such as China to be part of the process, probably more as a mediation power than a negotiating power, but in any case, and the situation in the US, the situation in Europe may, and the initiative of Orban may, let's say, help the Europeans to make the right choice. And especially if you see the situation on the ground, I said there are three options for the future. Either Ukraine defeats Russia, or Russia defeats Ukraine, or you have a political settlement on a negotiation table. Now, we see that it's very unlikely that Ukraine can defeat Russia. Physically, I don't see that, and nobody seriously can consider an option where you have a physical defeat of Russia. You may have a victory here or there, and you may define this as a decisive victory, but Russia will definitely not be defeated. If Europeans refuse to engage into any kind of negotiation and refuse that Zelensky engage in negotiation, as they have done 3 times so far in February 2022, in March 2022, and in August 2022, if the Europeans refuse Ukraine to engage in such talks, then there is only one solution left. This is the total defeat of Ukraine. And in fact, this is probably the message that the Russians try to convey by bombing and destroying systematically the war economy potential of Ukraine. That's probably the purpose of all that, because then it shows that at one point Ukraine will physically not be able to defend itself. And that will be a problem for Ukraine, by the way. And the whole posture of Europe will be a problem, a domestic problem for Ukraine, because within Ukraine, you still have those strongly anti-Russian forces. They are still there. And even if you have a peace agreement, it's very unlikely that those forces will just shut down or stop. They will be there. So this will be a considerable challenge, both from the Ukrainian government and the European government, to convince not just Zelensky, but to convince Ukrainians that the negotiations is the only way to go if Ukraine wants to remain in some form. So this is a challenge. I don't see the Europeans ready at this stage to make any effort to help Ukraine to engage into negotiations. And on the other side, I see that Zelensky is pressed internally not to engage into negotiations, even though I think he understands that he was, in fact, he was lured by the Europeans as he refused the treaty or the agreement with the Russians in March 22. And I think he starts to realize that the help and the support until up to necessary and up to as long as as needed, this help will not come as long as needed. And as Joe Biden himself said, this is not as long as needed, but as long as we can. And the problem is that the Europeans cannot. So they made a promise to Ukraine that they are not able to fulfill. And Zelensky starts to understand that. And that's the reason why he understands that it's necessary now to change the course of action and probably to have discussion with the Russians with all the reservations I mentioned before.
It seems that if Trump wins, the policy in Ukraine would be changed drastically. But how about the policy toward China? When you look at the latest NATO summit, they're talking about China, they're talking about shifting the focus on China. The question is, how prepared is Europe to get involved in a conflict with China?
The conflict of China is of totally different nature. Remember that the pivot towards the East was started by Obama, not even by Trump, even if Trump continued on that way. The problem of China is that China has become a competitor to US, and China is challenging the economic power of of the US. And that's something that the US doesn't want. And the idea of making America great again, the MAGA policy, if you want, is addressing exactly that. And in fact, as you rightly said, even if the policy towards Ukraine changes, uh, don't expect any change toward China. I would even say that the problem with China will even increase. And I think the Chinese have understood that. Even if the unknown factor is probably that Donald Trump is less ideologically driven than the Democrats and especially Biden. And remember that as Donald Trump was in as a president, he tried to have an agreement with North Korea, and he wanted to have negotiations opened with North Korea. North Korea is not China, and definitely North Korea is not threatening China. But North Korea is considered by South Korea by a strong enemy. So we may have here a more pragmatic approach to the conflict with Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump has a economic background, if you want. He is a businessman. He's a business background, not an ideological one. And everything that will serve his purpose, it will do everything that serves his purpose. And that's the reason why he may find a solution, as did Nixon in the 70s, to have an agreement with China. By the way, remember that this was an initiative of the US, even though China at that time was hardcore Marxist, and that didn't prevent the US administration to have an agreement with China and to have even a cooperation. I remind you that you had even listening stations of the NSA and CIA based in China for a while. So that means that, in essence, if you want to address the problem from a pragmatic point of view, that's a possible solution, and that's the specificity of Trump. He is unpredictable on that side. So, but if we just consider the current situation, we could say that Trump will put more emphasis on China, and that may be probably not so confrontational or militarily, but it might be economically confrontational. That might be the solution. But certainly the priority of the US will be China. The problem is that that Joe Biden has announced already some sanctions against, or tariffs. It's not really sanctions, but these are tariffs against Chinese products, EVs and solar panels, and I don't know what coming to the US. European Union has followed that path by also introducing tariffs on EVs entering Europe. Problem is that, and semiconductors also, that's very important, because semiconductors are, they're not just provided by China, they're also purchased by China, meaning that if you prevent Chinese semiconductors to come to the West, China will prevent semiconductors from the West to come into China. And they started to develop very aggressively new semiconductors, very advanced semiconductors, that eventually may compete and may, in fact, jeopardize the mere existence of the Western industry of semiconductors. As a result, you have, and that applies also, that's the reason why you had Mr. Habeck, the vice chancellor of Germany, traveling to China, because the problem is that when you restrict the Chinese cars to enter Europe, then the Chinese will do the same with European cars. And about 40% of the German cars are sold in China, meaning that you cannot make without the Chinese market. And, the problem of this, the world in which, in the one we live, is that you give and you receive, and everybody gains and lose, receives and gives to each other. And when you start in that scheme, you start to disrupt the relationships and to disrupt the trade, then sooner or later you will be victim from your own policy. And that's exactly what's happening to the West. And the problem is that the West is structurally weaker than China, because if we want to produce EVs, for instance, in Europe, we need Chinese components. And even recently, you had an article, I don't remember in which review in the US, that said that about 24% of high-tech military equipment is involving or uses Chinese equipment or Chinese components. So, meaning that when we start a war against China, we are addressing products that we are not able to produce ourselves. Now, if you look at China, China has the advantage of a totally vertically structured organization. That means that basically Huawei, if you take that example, that produce cell phones, and it has all the necessary components at home. It doesn't really need, even if it will probably get some components in South Korea also. But in essence, China has potentially all the components at home. And that's not the case for Europe. I mean, that's not the case for the US, and certainly not for Europe, meaning that we are in a weaker position than China to compete in such kind of economic war. As a result, we will be the loser of such a situation. And there is only one way if we want to be great again, if we want to compete with China, and if we want to be successful in an economic war against China. It's not about trying to disrupt China. It's just to be better ourselves. We need to invest more in research and development. We need to be better. We need to develop our capacities. China produces more engineers than the West, basically, about 4 times more engineers than the US. I mean, I don't have, I'm not 100% sure about my figures, but in essence, the overall direction is this one. The Chinese have invested considerably in education, in producing, in quotation mark, producing engineers. And while in the West, we have exactly the opposite. We have a decrease in production of engineers. And you see more and more, for instance, scientific papers and so on. I mean, significant ones. Those papers that have, in terms of research and development, have a significant weight, if you want. China is producing more and more of those scientific papers. while the West is proportionately decreasing its production of significant scientific and technical papers. So we see that China has put considerable efforts in research and development, in developing a solid base, industrial base, developing an infrastructure that allows this economic base to work within the country. I mean, look just at the high-speed railways network and things like this. That is, it's unmatched in history, of the world history, not just China's history. So if we want to compete with China, and I'm not against the idea of competing with China, but it should not be with measures that try to destroy China. It should be with measures that try to improve ourselves. And that's exactly the challenge that we are facing. The problem is that we are absolutely not on that way, on that path. Our educational system is degrading every year. We have less and less individuals. I mean, I'm talking about Europe and especially France, have less and less young uh, students who are literate in mathematics. So you can have any kind of diploma and things like this, but no longer in scientific and research. I mean, there are still some, but not significantly in order to improve or to compete with China. And I'm just mentioning China, but I should also mention India and other countries. I mean, Asian countries have considerably devoted resources to education. Look at countries that are probably not considered as the top notch in terms of technological development, such as Iran. But Iran had to develop its educational system in order to be able to cope with all the sanctions that affect the country. In other words, instead of buying abroad what they didn't have, they had to produce it. In order to produce it, they had to have engineers and individuals able to develop production capabilities and capacities. And that's what they have done. So the whole policy of containment that the West has developed against China, Iran, and other countries has, in fact, the opposite effect. It prompted these countries to develop their own capacities and to be, in fact, self-sufficient or almost self-sufficient in certain areas, meaning that today these countries are competing with the West. We are talking about, I mean, you haven't addressed the question. I mean, we haven't addressed today the question of the Middle East and the Houthis striking Israel. But they are striking Israel with weapons that are particularly advanced, that even Israel, which is considered as a very high-tech country with high-tech army, even Israel is not able to stop the drones that attacked Tel Aviv, or the missiles that attacked Haifa, or not Haifa, Eilat, and so on. So, meaning that we are seeing that these technological capabilities that have been developed in those countries that we try to exclude from the international community, well, those countries are not stupid. They developed their capacities, and today these capacities are not only matching, but they are probably outperform the West and Western capabilities. So I think, again, we are on a totally wrong pathway regarding these the countries. I may understand this idea that we need to keep, as Boris Johnson said, that the West should keep its hegemony. Well, I'm not sure we need to have this hegemony, but let's assume we want to keep it. Let's keep it by being better, not by making other worse. You know, and that I think is the conclusion of all this sequence that we have. And again, in the U.S., I'm not sure that this kind of behavior, let's say, to have a more, let's say, a better understanding of each other, and I'm talking about the West versus China. I'm not sure it's still in place, this kind of vision. But it might be that individuals like Trump, who are not ideological, but more, let's say, instinctive in their behavior, they may understand that with just what we say the common sense, and that may change the let's say the art of relationships we have between the West and China. The problem is that you mentioned NATO and its behavior towards China. And that's where I have my serious concerns. Because, as I said, the problem with China is basically the this kind of competition between a fading uh, superpower and an emerging new superpower. Basically, that's what we have. But in between, you have Europe. And by following the narrative of the US, I feel that the Europeans have not found their own way in this world, and that they are still too much focused on their relationship with the US instead of focusing on a more ubiquitous um, position, not just toward one actor, but between all actors. Europe could be a bridge between the US and East, if you want. But it doesn't want to play this role. And that's exactly, by the way, what you had with Ukraine in 2014. Europe, instead of using Ukraine, and that was said by Henry Kissinger, by the way, at that time. He said, instead of taking Ukraine as a bridge between East and West, European Union turned Ukraine into a wall between the East and West. And today you have exactly the same behavior with Europe. Instead of being a bridge between US and China and even Russia, Europe is acting like a wall between the two. So I don't understand the position of Europe, because Europe is in fact the big loser. And as of today, it's certainly the case, because the war in Ukraine has definitely benefited to Russia and its relationship with China. And indirectly, it has benefited to China, India, and Russia. I mean, if you just take those major powers. I'm not sure the conflict has benefited to the US, but let's say the US has not suffered that much from the conflict. But the part of the world that has suffered the much for the conflict, or the most, is Europe. And the most was, in fact, the most of the weight of the conflict was borne by Germany, and incidentally France also. But anyway, so we see that Europe is suffering from this conflict, has not even identified this, or doesn't want to identify this, because it still wants to consider the conflict from an ideological perspective, instead of looking at the conflict from a more pragmatic and more economic perspective. And that's exactly the problem we face. So NATO is not prepared to be active, militarily speaking, in the Pacific area. You have some partners of the North Atlantic Alliance, like Australia, which is part of this partnership with NATO. You have Japan, who I think is also a member of this partnership, but it's just a partnership. It's not NATO. NATO is militarily not ready to operate in that part of the world. And there's little point for NATO to be active militarily in the Pacific area. So we can see that support that was declared at the last NATO summit, the support of the US policy towards China is more in declaratory nature than effective in essence, I think. But it means that regardless of what happens on the eastern side of the Eurasian continent, the Europe will somehow back the United States in Europe if there is, let's assume there is a war in China involving the US and Chinese, and Russia would support then China, then you might have a situation where Europe or the European part of NATO would then support United States. That's probably, but that's a very unlikely scenario that I see at this stage. So we are talking about a speculative situation or fiction at this stage. So that's
When
how I
you look
see
at,
it.
yeah, right now Netanyahu is in the United States trying to convince, it seems that he's trying to convince policymakers in the United States to let them attacking Hezbollah. Do you think that he's gonna get the permission to attack Hezbollah, and how prepared is the Israeli army to do that?
Oh, I think Netanyahu has several problems. First of all, he's fighting a war on several fronts. I mean, Gaza is certainly one. The Houthis certainly one. West Bank is another one. North of Israel is another one. And I'm not even counting the possible, I mean, the conflict he feeds, it feeds by striking Syria and all that. So, and the Houthis, of course. So we have Netanyahu, which is a very, let's say, tricky strategic situation, which could be stopped instantly if there is an agreement between Palestinians and the Israeli government. Because everything that is unfolding in Israel is related to a ceasefire between Palestinians and Israel. Remember that the Houthis declared that they would support they would in fact support the idea of a ceasefire by imposing sanctions against Israel. And the missiles attack against Israel are in fact in order to implement this kind of sanctions. The Houthis are as a matter of fact, the Houthis are implementing the same policy as the West is doing on other occasions. Even if we could be, I'm very, let's say, critical about the use or disuse of unilateral sanctions, embargoes, and all that. But the fact of the matter is that that's the position of the Houthis. The same from the side of Hezbollah. The Hezbollah has no intention to attack Israel, but they exert a pressure on the northern part of Israel in order to alleviate the pressure on Gaza, meaning that if you have a ceasefire, this will stop. The problem in the West Bank is a different nature, and I will come back to that. But in essence, most of the problems that Netanyahu has in the moment are related to its strategy towards the Palestinians, the possible existence of a Palestinian state, and the behavior in Gaza itself. So this could stop within days, in fact, if you want. But he's in a difficult situation, and the situation is worsening since the Houthis are now targeting Israeli cities, which was not the case before. On the other hand, Netanyahu coming today in the United States is in a good environment, if you want, in the US, because definitely Donald Trump is a supporter of Israel. And for that reason, I don't expect any major change in the US policy towards Israel after the Trump election. Even if Trump is, as you know, very unexpected, and he may have unexpected reaction or decisions. But in essence, I think he is definitely pro-Israel. Remember that that was Donald Trump who decided to recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights by Israel, which is contrary to the international law. And he also recognized Jerusalem as the true capital city of Israel, which is also against international law. And subsequently, he moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is also against international law. I mean, this is not against international law per se, because the US may have its embassy anywhere in Israel, but that was not the idea that Jerusalem would be the capital city of Israel. As per Resolution 181 from the United Nations. In any case, so Trump definitely is pro-Israel. The Biden administration, what's left from the Biden administration, let's put it that way, remains also strongly in favor of Israel. What might affect the climate in Washington, D.C. is the popular pressure, because we see here a clear discrepancy between what the elite think in terms of relationship with Israel and the population in the US, which is increasingly adversarial to Israel and want the US to stop its support to Israel. But when we go to the Congress and when addressing the Congress, we can say that in that environment, Netanyahu is in a good position. Now, the US certainly doesn't want to be again back fighting in the Middle East. And they don't want for Israel to be involved in a war, an open war with Hezbollah in the South Lebanon. So that's certainly what the Americans don't want, because they know the implications of that. First of all, they will support another failure, because I assume that if Israel is not able to have a success in Gaza, with all the logistical and operational limitations of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, if Israel is not able to master the situation there, they will certainly not able to master the situation in South Lebanon. They will repeat the experience of 2006, when the Israeli army was defeated, in fact, by the Hezbollah, despite all the distractions created by Israel. So we might have another failure, and the US so far has supported only failures. It failed in Afghanistan, it failed in Iraq, it failed in Syria, it failed in Libya, it failed in supporting Ukraine, and so far it has failed in supporting Israel. So we see that the US is constantly supporting the wrong guy. And I'm not sure that, I mean, we can exclude that, again, that the politicians react irrationally as they did so far. But I have the feeling that more and more people understand that waging a war in the Middle East is not as simple as it seems, and that the fighting a war against Saddam Hussein was probably easy 30 years ago, but fighting a war against Hezbollah today on the Hezbollah's territory, by the way, that will be a completely different matter, and that may fail. And again, we have this, I have mentioned that several times, but I think more and more individuals mention the risk for Israel to disappear, because I'm talking about physical disparition, because more and more people are, let's say, angry at Israel in the region. I mean, Israel has never managed to develop good relations with its neighbors. All the relations with the neighbors like Egypt or Jordan, they were in fact they were improved with the support of the US, under the pressure of the US, I would say. But more and more, these countries understand that this support for Israel is not, it doesn't, let's say, is not mirrored by the position of the population. And even if the population in the Middle East is essentially peaceful, they get annoyed by this permanent, aggressive, and violent and brutal behavior of Israel. And therefore, these ways of certain Arabic countries to be accommodating Israel is no longer accepted by the population. And that is something that, if you have an aggression from Israel towards South Lebanon, that may trigger something much bigger than simply a conflict as we had before between Lebanon and Israel. That may have another impact, a regional impact. Remember that the Arab League decided to take out of the list of terrorist organization the Hezbollah. The Hezbollah was put on this list under the pressure of the Americans, but just a couple of weeks ago, they decided to remove Hezbollah from that list. And the consequence of that is not benign, because that means that therefore it becomes lawful to help Hezbollah, to support Hezbollah, to provide weapons, political support, and even military support to Hezbollah. So these are factors that the Western media have absolutely not considered, because they consider that as secondary. I think these are very important steps, both mentally, politically, but also militarily and on a security stage, because that indicates that Arab countries have a different position regarding Hezbollah and its relation with Israel. And remember the contact and the relationships that have developed between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So we see that the whole setting of the Middle East and the Near East has changed in the last year. We can say that in the last year, meaning that the consequences of Israel attacking South Lebanon today might have wider implications than what we have seen in 2006 with the and in the previous Israeli interventions in South Lebanon. And I think the Americans are aware of that, and that for that reason, they will probably try to discourage Netanyahu to have um, to settle the situation militarily, but will suggest to Netanyahu to have a political settlement of the crisis. Because there is another thing. I mentioned I said I would come back on the West Bank. And here there is also something in the last week that is quite important. This is this advisory judgment provided by the International Court of Justice regarding the Israeli policy towards the occupied territories. And in essence, we could say that everything that is in this advisory document, I mean, just as to the history of this document, in December 2022, the General Assembly tasked the International Court of Justice to provide an advice on the situation of the occupied territories, the Palestinian occupied territories. And the ICG just gave his advice. So it's an advice. It's not legally binding, but as a document provided by the ICG, it's part of the international law, even if it's not legally binding. That's important to underline. And at the same time, it has just a little bit more weight than just an advice, because it was specifically asked for by the UN General Assembly, meaning that it's not a unilateral decision from the ICG. It's the result of a tasking by the UN General Assembly. And that's very important to underline as well. So meaning that when the ICG declares the occupation of Palestinian territories by Israel as unlawful, it is certainly consequential, even if this is just a repetition of something that you have in almost 100 UN resolutions. So nothing new in that. This is just an updated advice of the ICG regarding, but we can say that the decision of the Security Council and the General Assembly, those resolutions are politically driven. The advice of the ICG is legally driven, meaning that we have a legal advice saying it's illegal to have this presence, and the way its presence is materialized is also in its essence illegal. But more importantly, I think something that has not been mentioned by Western media is that the ICG asked to all the states not to support and not to provide support to Israel in order to prevent Israel to make this policy in the occupied territories. So this is not just an advice saying we consider that illegal, but it's also an advice to all the nations not to take part in this illegal occupation by providing support to Israel. And that includes the economical matter, like, for instance, BDS. So boycott, divestment, the investment and sanctions, for instance, this movement that originated in the United States, which has been declared illegal by some states like France and others in Europe. BDS is in essence legal because it's exactly in line with the decision or the advice of the International Court of Justice. And just as a reminder, BDS is about, because you know that in the occupied territories, Palestinians have or had, because a lot has been destroyed by the Israelis, but the Palestinians had an economic activity like producing olive oil, for instance, or oranges and lemons or things like this. And the problem is that these items that were cultivated and produced in the occupied territories were sold abroad under the label of made in Israel. And that's illegal. That's illegal. I mean, if something is produced on the occupied territories, it should be indicated as such and marketed as such in our shops and all that, and stores. But problem is that Israel doesn't do that. It markets that as made in Israel, and and that's the rationale for having the BDS movement, in order to re-establish the legality of the let's say the ownership of production of the Palestinians. Now, the advisory document of the ICG confirms that everything that has been produced in the occupied territories must be marketed as Palestinian product. Now, another things that this advisory document says is that all the settlements that are in the occupied territory, namely specifically in the West Bank, these settlements should be evacuated by Israel. So the terrain and the ground and their territories should be returned to the Palestinians. So that's very strong advice by the International Court of Justice. And the ICG asked for the support of the international community to implement these measures. That means that the policy that is implemented by the government of Netanyahu, and I just as a reminder, remember that two ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, are both originating and they live in occupied territories, basically. So meaning that the support to the government of Israel, in fact, if you apply by the letter and by the spirit the advice of the International Court of Justice, you shouldn't even support the government of Israel. So we are I mean, the visit of Netanyahu in the US comes in this context, which shows that, in fact, the world, the understanding of the international community about the situation in Israel is changing. The behavior, and we have seen all these movements in the US, especially in universities and all that, regarding the situation in Palestine, and the movement of support for Palestine is very strong. And that means that the pressure on Netanyahu, despite the fact that Trump might be more, let's say, supportive than Biden in the future, But nevertheless, the overall mood, both in the US, especially in the population, and in the world population, is increasingly against Israel and against its policy. So I don't know exactly what will come out of this visit of Netanyahu in Washington, D.C. And probably it may come back with the expression of a support from the Congress to Israel and to the existence of Israel and all that. But at the same time, I'm not sure it will come back with a definite support for making more military interventions anywhere in the Middle East as it does. And probably now again, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball that tells me what the result of this visit will be. But I I I can assume that the discussions that Netanyahu will have with the varying factions in the Congress probably will indicate that he should try to find a political settlement of the situation. That's my personal view. That's also my hope somehow. And my hope is probably not exactly as objective as it should, but I think Israel now is at a crossroad, in my view. And if Israel wants to continue to exist, simply to exist, it will have to find a more accommodating behavior with its neighbors, and primarily with its first neighbors, which are the Palestinians. And I think this is unavoidable. And the problem I see is that what we are seeing today and in the last couple of days happening in Gaza, with almost every day you have a massacre somehow, that indicates that the more Israel is conducting its operation in Gaza, the more it will be difficult to move backwards. Because even though I think the Palestinians are probably less revengeful than the Israelis are, I mean, in terms of policy, if you want, the Palestinians may be more, let's say, accommodating if there is a political settlement than the Israelis. But that's my personal view based on my experience. But nevertheless, we see that what Israel is doing now doesn't go in the direction of an appeasement of the situation. On the contrary, I have the feeling that Israel is looking for having a degraded situation in order to justify more, let's say, violent behavior. So that's my personal view. I don't know exactly, but the fact what we are seeing on the ground doesn't show any attempt from Israel to calm down the situation. And that seems to be a little bit worrying. And I hope that the politicians, even though they are supportive to Israel, but probably because they are supportive to Israel, that they might indicate to Netanyahu a better way of solving the problem than just making new massacres.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That's my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a nice